Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming for our keynote address this year. I just want to take a second to introduce our keynote speaker. This is Dr. John Tchernev. You see his bio in the program. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Dr. Tchernev, as you see, has a very interesting history. He spent time out in Hollywood working and in the movie industry and television industry, and then went back and got his doctorate. And that is where I met John. John and I went to graduate school together. So we go back a little ways, and that's why I wanted to invite him out here. I thought he would be the perfect person to come and speak to everyone today. And I just will give the floor to my good friend John Tchernev. So.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks, Steve. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it, and it's also an honor to be invited here. Steve told me to try to be interesting and funny, so I'm going to try, but we'll see what you guys think. This is going to be a little bit of a strange talk. I'm going to talk for the first half a little bit about my background because I wanted to kind of tell a story about how my background working in the industry actually led me to come back to school and how it's kind of informed some of my research. So I'm going to talk for the first few minutes about kind of my experiences working in the entertainment industry and then how I kind of have brought that into academia. So I started with a couple internships back when I was in college as an undergraduate. My first one was at MSNBC back when they were in New Jersey. They actually had this big giant warehouse that they were in. This was back around 2000. And so I worked there and I realized that this was their master control where this is where they got all the satellite feeds and stuff. I'm sorry, the pictures aren't very good. The reason why the pictures aren't good is because I wasn't supposed to take pictures in there. And so I turned my flash off and then took a bunch of pictures. But anyway, it was kind of cool. It was really exciting to work for like a national news network. And I thought, oh, news looks really interesting. And then I realized everyone who works in news is stressed out and miserable. And I was like, so that was a very helpful learning experience for me to realize I don't want to do that. Then the next summer, I got an internship in Los Angeles through the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, who put us on the Emmys. And they have a nice internship program that's paid, which, as some of you know, a paid internship is a really rare and wonderful thing if you can get it. So I was excited. They then assign you to whatever show they decide to put you on. So I ended up working for Lifetime Television for Women, which was not probably my first choice if I were to pick myself, but it was actually a great experience. I worked for a show called Any Day Now, and I was given kind of a run-of-the-mill as a production assistant and as an intern. I hung out with the camera crew quite a bit. Here's just some shots I took on set and stuff with some of the camera crew, the Steadicam operator. They had this poor guy also strapped to a car. This is how they would shoot people talking in a car, is just strap the camera operator to the back and have him hang on real hard. So I really learned a lot about production. I personally was fascinated by filmmaking. I was a film major, and I was very interested in working in production and kind of seeing what the directors did, what the camera people did, what the grips and gaffers did. And I acquired a nickname. I was only there for like a couple months, but it was kind of fun. I really kind of got to know everyone. And so what's funny is that one of the grips on the very first day, he says, "Oh, you look like my Uncle Louie." And so then everyone's like, "Oh, Uncle Louie." And so I literally got called Uncle Louie by every single person on the crew. And I think only like one person knew my real name even. And so literally years later, I would be somewhere else in Los Angeles and I would suddenly just hear someone go, "Uncle Louie!" And it would be some guy who had worked on the show and they'd recognize me. So it was kind of fun. I actually got a cake when I left. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "We will miss you, Uncle Louie," which is kind of funny. So I worked at these internships and really had a very interesting experience. And so I basically felt like I could not wait to finish school and actually get out, because this was done before my senior year. And I finished up my senior year in college, and I was like, I cannot wait to get out of here and go work in the entertainment industry. And then 8 years later, I was equally as excited to get the hell out of Los Angeles and get back to school. So and I think I would have been very unhappy in either case if I hadn't made a transition. So I want to just talk briefly about what happened and how I worked and what kind of work I did in Los Angeles. My two biggest breaks both came from people hiring me by mistake, which was great because that just seems to be something that if it worked in my favor, it was fine with me. So the first one was on the show called Futurama on Fox back in the day. And the way I got hired was I literally moved out to LA with everything in my car and sent out about 80 resumes and cover letters to different TV shows, movie studios, anyone in the entertainment industry I could think of. And no one was really interested. And I was looking for a job as a production assistant, kind of at the bottom of the food chain, and didn't really have any connections. And I sent one to the show Futurama, among many other places. And I called them first. I found their number for the production office. And so I called them and asked them who to send my resume to. And the person on the phone told me the wrong person. And so they gave me the name of Brian Cowan, who was the line producer, when actually the person who usually hired the PAs was someone who worked for him named Christine. And so what happened was I sent my resume by mistake to the boss, who then doesn't usually get resumes. And so he actually looked at it, saw it, and then he called me a week later, which was unusual. And he said, we don't have anything, but I'll let you know if it opens up. And we talked on the phone a little bit, and he was really nice. And then 2 weeks later, someone quit, and they had an opening, and he called me in for an interview. And what's funny is I much later saw in the office of Christine, who was the woman who I should have sent my resume to, I saw the stack of resumes that she had of people who wanted a PA position, literally probably a couple hundred of them. And I had accidentally circumvented all of that and gone to her boss and sent him my resume, and he was like, oh, I don't get resumes usually to look at. Yeah. And so he actually, he liked me, and I ended up getting the job. And so that was great. I worked there for almost 2 years. And after I was a film major, I got my college degree, I made a senior film. I was all excited. I thought I was going to take the industry by storm. And I would be directing movies within a week or two and be a head writer on a show immediately. But no, I was a production assistant, which is basically, you may think it's only just about getting coffee and stuff for the producers. It's not just that. You also sometimes have to get them lunch. So there's a whole variety of ways that you put your college degree to use, So it's a lot of taking lunch orders, a lot of making photocopies. But it was a great learning experience. I got to meet all kinds of people. I got to see how they record the show and work and see the animators and so forth. And then unfortunately, the show got canceled about a year after I got there. And so it was a long process of wrapping up the show and so forth. But I eventually was looking for something new and hoping to kind of move up in the world. But instead, I was thinking at least I can only go up from here. But actually, I found out that there is a worse job than production assistant. And that is something that's called a night PA, which is a night production assistant, it's like being a regular production assistant, except for you're at night. And so I got hired on this show called Reba, which, again, probably a show I would have never watched on my own, but it was fun, I guess, to get hired on it. And so they needed someone to come in and work nights. And my job was literally to make 200 photocopies of the entire script every night. And the writers would rewrite all day. And then I would make about 200 copies. It was on the Fox lot. I would distribute it around the Fox lot. And then I would get in my car and drive it to the actors' homes and deliver them a script so they could read it over breakfast. And I would deliver it to the executives at Warner Brothers up in Burbank. And so my job was literally just photocopies and driving. And that was it. I would work about 60 hours a week, come in every night around 7 to 9 p.m. in that area, work till about 4 or 5 in the morning. And it was not the most glamorous job. I think that to say a monkey could do it would be to kind of, be insulting to monkeys, because probably a lower form of animal could probably do it, like a possum. Basically, if you could just teach them to push the start button on the copier. But it was really what was disappointing about it was not the fact that it was like manual labor. What was more that it was really when everyone else left for the day. And so the whole point of getting a job in the industry as a production assistant is to kind of make connections and meet people and learn what what everyone else is doing. And so this was really a disappointing job because of that. So I literally would come in as the writers are leaving, didn't get to know anyone at all, and then I would just work there at night with the janitors and basically just be sitting in front of the copy machine. So anyway, so I ended up quitting that, and I then got work at Paramount TV, where I met a woman who was one of the production coordinators for the studio, and she really liked me and kind of said, don't worry, we'll find you a job, we'll keep you working, which was really nice, except for all she had available was just more PA jobs. And so I ended up spending the next 2 years bumping around on different shows and stuff as a production assistant. One thing that I learned is that things tend to get canceled a lot in the TV industry. I worked on all kinds of wonderful shows you've never heard of, such as a pilot called Like Cats and Dogs, and a show called Second Time Around on UPN that ran for 12 episodes before it got canceled. And there was one called Bad Girl's Guide to Life with Jenny McCarthy that got canceled after 6 episodes. And then there was a show called Out of Practice with Henry Winkler that was a pilot I worked on, and that ran for a whole year, but I ended up quitting and not working on it for the whole year because I found that I was kind of really getting sick of the PA life after a couple years. So I decided to focus more on writing, and I worked for a company that developed scripts and owned a lot of fiction properties in terms of novels and so forth that they were trying to develop into screenplays. So I got to work in script development for about a year or two. I also constantly took writing classes. I took some at Improv Olympic. I took some improv classes at the Groundlings. I took a writing workshop with a retired writer named Bill Idelson, who had a workshop in his kitchen that was probably where I learned more about writing than anywhere else, actually. Just from this guy who would just have a few people over for Sunday brunch, and we would come over and he would just talk, and we would go through some scenes and like read some scenes and watch some shows and kind of analyze what was going on with the storytelling. And that was probably the most informative thing I did the entire time. And then I got hired by mistake a second time. So what's funny is that one of the producers from Futurama from back in the day called me out of the blue when I was unemployed and said, hey, I'm working for Cartoon Network on this new show. It's called Class of 3000, has Andre 3000 from Outcast, and we need a writer's assistant, which is a bump up from a production assistant, so that was very exciting for me. And he mistakenly thought that I had been one of the writer's assistants on Futurama, which meant that which the writer's assistants were the people who sit in the room with the writers and kind of take the notes and write up the screenplay and are in charge of putting out the script. And it's a great way to get into becoming a writer and to really interact and socialize with the writers. And so he forgot that I was the guy who just got the lunches. I didn't have the glorious job of actually being the writer's assistant on Futurama. So he forgot that I hadn't done that, and I didn't know how to do it. So he thought I was that guy. And I didn't disabuse him of the notion, but he was like, hey, we need a writer's assistant. I know you can do it. And so I kind of figured out a little bit later on that he thought I had been the writer's assistant. And I told him later, and he thought that was kind of funny. But I was like, haha, you hired me. I've been here a couple months now. You can't fire me anymore. And it worked out great. So I was the writer's assistant on this. I got to sit in the room. It was just a couple people really writing the show. For Cartoon Network, it was like 3 writers. And so I ended up getting staffed as a writer myself for the second season of the show. And I got to be part of the Writers Guild, which was great. This is Patrick Verone, who was the head writer on it. And this was our whiteboard, which is the most important thing in a writer's room, where you put down all the story ideas and break the stories. Boy, it's amazing how the computer monitors look dated nowadays, using one of those big monitors. And then the Writers Guild went on strike. So I got into the Writers Guild, and then we immediately striked. This was in 2008, so I had to go picket. This is me picketing Fox with a lot of people. And I basically, through a lot of this, as I learned more and became more interested in writing, I also worked on writing some screenplays. And I had some interest in those, but I really also found that I was getting more interested in how people use media and how people in the media are interested in putting especially persuasive or social messages into their content. Because a lot of people, you may be shocked to hear this, but a lot of Hollywood can be liberal. And actually, a lot of people care quite a bit about issues, whether they're environmental issues or healthcare or all kinds of political things. And regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum, you know, a lot of people realize that when you work in television or film, you have a huge mouthpiece, you have a huge audience that can be reached by your work, and a lot of people try or want to try to put in messages that they think have some social relevance into their work. And of course, there's lots of examples where people have done that. There's also lots of times where that is, the studios try to say, hey, don't do that, please keep it light and fun, don't put socially, you know, don't put social messages or political messages in your entertainment stuff. But I find that kind of uncomfortable marriage of entertainment and persuasion very interesting. And so as I was working as a writer, I actually wanted to try to put in things that had some meaning and some relevance, and then I decided I really kind of missed, frankly, I missed learning new things and decided I wanted to come back to academia. And so I really have been studying that for the last, I don't know, 8 years or so. So I'm going to transition a little bit into talking a little bit about some of the research I've been doing and how it comes out of writing in my background. So narratives, and by that I just mean a story, they're really fundamental to how we understand the world. It seems like there's some research indicating that we actually probably understand most of what's happening in our brain is interpreting the world through stories. We tell ourselves stories about everything, about ourselves, about why we do things, about why other people do things. We're providing explanations and a framework to understand all the input around us. And narratives also provide guidance for a lot of our lives through morals, through practical knowledge, teaching us how to interact socially. And they do have a lot of persuasive power. You see that with health campaigns, environmental campaigns. You see this a lot with the use of narratives in a lot of formats that I'll talk about in a minute. In TV, lots of shows and movies and so forth have used narratives to try to make a point. ER, Law and Order, movies like The Green Mile. Full House, if you remember that show. I felt like the kids in Full House would screw up somehow every episode, and then Bob Saget would sit them down about 22 minutes into the 30-minute episode and have a heart-to-heart talk. And Michelle or one of the kids would learn a lesson and say, "I'm sorry, Dad." And then they would hug it out, and then you'd have a funny tagline at the end, right? And then that was every single episode of Full House. And so it was always about kind of teaching the kids some sort of message or moral. And it hasn't been studied too much from an academic side. I mean, there is obviously work on it, but you know, compared to the amount we study overt persuasion, such as political rhetoric and health campaigns and stuff, climate change, there's been a lot of overt persuasion out there. We study things such as door-to-door salesmen. We've been studying advertisements for probably 100 years almost in this field. And there's been a lot of books written about persuasion and about kind of really a lot of these come at persuasion more from like an overt way and looking at when people know they're being persuaded, when someone is a salesman or a politician and so forth, whereas narrative persuasion is arguably coming at things from a slightly different approach and maybe using different psychological mechanisms in the way it works. Now, it's not a new thing. Narratives have been used as persuasive tools forever, dating back to Aesop's fables, which have a moral to them. This thing called the Bible, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's full of stories. A lot of them have a point. And Law and Order, another time-honored, famous set of stories that is always on TV any time of day. So narratives they are often used and they often have a persuasive message in them, but it hasn't really been studied that way very much, especially not in an empirical way. And it seems like that doesn't play by the same rules as overt persuasion. In other words, it seems like when audiences are enjoying a story or transported into a story, it seems like they are often more accepting of a social message or a persuasive cue. And we may think that's good or bad. It may be kind of almost sneaky in a way to kind of put messages into a story, but it's something that happens quite a bit. And so I think it's worth studying for sure. And so some of the key questions that guide my research are what makes one narrative more engaging than another, which, by the way, if I could answer that, I'd have $1 billion from the studios probably in my pocket, but I'm working on it. Let me know if you have any ideas. And kind of more specifically, how does audience develop identification with the main character throughout the course of a narrative? One thing that we found is that as people watch stories, the more transported they are, the more likely they are to be persuaded if there's a persuasive message. And probably one of the most important drivers, definitely one of the most important drivers of whether people enjoy or get engaged in a story is whether or not they identify with the main character or one of the characters. We often study this. In terms of empirical work in communication, a lot of the work that I've done and other people do is kind of treating narratives like they're a black box, like we basically have people come in, if we do an experiment, they fill out a survey, then we have them watch a TV show or a movie, and then they do another questionnaire afterwards, and we ask them, did your opinions change, or how much did you enjoy it? And so we're basically treating the whole experience of watching TV or a movie as like this kind of Rube Goldberg machine almost, where we don't know what's going on, there's a lot of stuff happening, but we kind of measure them, we measure how they feel beforehand, and then we kind of see effects afterwards without really knowing what's going on in between. And so that's kind of what I would call retrospective measures, where we ask people afterwards, how much did you enjoy the show, how much did you feel persuaded by it, and so forth. It's really providing just like an overall summary, though, of how much you enjoyed the show or were persuaded by it. You can't really test causal models in a really rigorous way that way. And it's a good way for finding what effects might occur, but not really why. And it doesn't really give you much guidance for message construction when you're actually looking at the entire story. If you say, hey, this show A was effective, but TV show B was not effective, how as a message creator can you possibly disentangle those when you're looking at so many possible factors within a single TV show? So I argue for a need for a deeper and more dynamic or dynamicer understanding, which is not really just methodological, but really a different theoretical lens for looking at things. A lot of people have called for this, calling for research into the content of narratives and the processes of how people experience it. Gehrig, Cohen, and a whole bunch of other people have kind of talked about how the field needs to go in this direction, which is tricky. It's a difficult thing to do, to actually scientifically study stories. But that's kind of where I'm trying to maybe make a little bit of inroads, drawing on my background as a writer. And so the question is, can we even try to understand narratives empirically through science? And to the extent that we think of social science as finding and explaining patterns in nature or finding patterns in the real world, then yes, to the extent we can identify them and predict them, we can. And so specifically, I'm looking at the structure of stories and also at identification with the protagonist as kind of two of the main drivers of how successful a story can be in reaching an audience and communicating with the audience. So real quickly, identification is, it's been shown to probably be the most important process for enjoyment and persuasive effects. It means to come for an empathic understanding of the character, of the feelings of the character and his or her motives and goals. So basically, if you think of it, a story, this is something I learned from this retired screenwriter named Bill Idelson, who was really smart, and he told me a very basic thing that's a very simple way of understanding stories. He said a story is a hero, an obstacle, and a goal. So a hero has a goal, but there's something in the way. There's an obstacle in between, and that's every story that's ever been written, at least any good one. And so basically the hero has to figure out some way to get to the goal. It doesn't matter if the goal is finding a boy meets girl story, trying to get the girl, or if it's an action movie with a hero trying to defeat a bad guy, or whether it's an internal drama where the hero is trying to overcome some flaw of their own. But we as the audience tend to take the perspective of the protagonist. So going back to my diagram, that would look like that probably from the hero's perspective, which is, okay, so it's not literally taking their perspective, but more figuratively taking their perspective. We identify with them, and that has several components: cognitive perspective taking, which means kind of thinking what they're thinking, emotionally feeling what they're feeling, so more affective, and motivation, which is kind of understanding and internalizing what's motivating the character to get to that goal, which I think could be a mixture of cognitive and affective. And that's kind of one of the key things because it's also talked about quite a bit in screenwriting literature is what's the character's motivation, what's driving the story. And in fact, that is literally the motor that can propel a story forward is the motivation of the character. If you read a synopsis of almost any story, it'll tell you in a sentence or two who is the hero and what is their obstacle and what's the goal. And typically what's their motivation to get to the goal. So this is going to get a little bit into some of the work I did for my dissertation and that I'm following up on now. I'm not going to go through all of this, but basically I'm going to talk about the left column first. I decided to kind of use these as some inroads to maybe look at what's going on inside of a narrative. And so I started with psychological motivations. And this is based on psychological research. Are there motivations that are very basic to all human beings? And so one thing that comes to mind would be Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which some of you may be familiar with. There's, basic kind of lower level needs, and then there's higher level needs. I decided to use a simpler model, which is kind of similar to Maslow, but it's by Alderfer, and he uses just 3 categories of needs, which makes things a little bit simpler. So I looked at, and his 3 categories are existence, relatedness, and growth. And so basically, he says humans are only motivated by really 3 types of things. Existence needs, which means staying alive, procreating, having food and water. Relatedness needs, well, I guess maybe that's procreating, relatedness, depending on how you do it. But that would be relating, and also just finding love, finding companionship, family, a sense of belonging. And then the last one would be growth, which is actually the highest order need and tends to be when the other needs are more satisfied, we care more about our own personal growth and our development. So learning new things, exploring, those would be growth type needs. And so all 3 are present in people, but there is kind of a hierarchy where existence is the most basic and the most pressing needs typically out of the 3. And so a second thing I looked at, and so basically what I was saying was, or what I was looking at was whether these types of motivations, if they're present in a story, will tend to particularly connect with people. And I think Alderfer would predict that the existence needs are the most universal, that everyone has these. And so therefore, the stories that should connect with the widest audiences are the ones that deal with the most basic emotions. And if you look at box office numbers, I think there's some truth to that, where a lot of movies that do the best are about fighting, action, are about, people. You have movies like Taken, where his daughter gets kidnapped. That's basically an existence type need. And the other thing that a lot of movies do is they really layer in all 3 types of needs sometimes. So you see movies where you have both the hero in a life or death battle, but there's also a love interest, so there's a relatedness need. And in a good story, often there's also some sort of character growth, some sort of growth motivation taking place. So the hero actually learns a lesson. And some of the best movies have a combination of all 3 of these, and they tend to reach the broadest audiences around the world, not just in America. So I looked at that. I also looked at one more thing. I know I'm running out of time, but looked at the hero's goals. Actually, I'm going to skip to screenplay structure real quick. So in screenwriting, there's a lot of different moments within a script, but screenplays are pretty structured. And so it has things such as the first appearance of the protagonist, the inciting incident, which is when the character's normal world is disrupted by the conflict that's going to be the main story of the movie. And the first act break would be when the hero begins their quest. As I talked about the hero, the obstacle, and the goal. The first act break is typically the hero figures out what the goal is they want, and the obstacle is then established in their way. And so that's kind of setting up our story. There's often also something that's called a save the cat scene, which is basically a scene where the hero does something like save a cat from a burning building, or does something to help someone else that makes the hero very likable. And so what I decided to do for this research was actually find these moments in films, and hypothesize that these should be particularly key moments for creating identification with an audience. So basically, I'm going to kind of skip through some of this real quickly. What we did is I got in a couple hundred participants. I had them watch several films. We randomly selected 3 films from the last 10 years that were released, and any genre was acceptable except for historical films like biopics and comedies, because we wanted to focus on the dramatic arcs of heroes and so forth. So we only looked at movies that were successful, meaning they were both critically well received. They got more than 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, and we wanted to include movies that did relatively well at the box office. So we didn't want to have the very top movies at the box office because we wanted people to see a movie they hadn't seen before. So we had numbers 11 through 50 of the top box office per year. So I made a sampling frame of 10 years worth of movies, basically 40 movies per year. So that's 400 movies. Then we randomly selected 3. We ended up with these 3: Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Rio, an Italian Job. Raise your hand if you've seen at least one of these. I'm just curious. Okay. Has anyone seen all 3 of them? Wow, okay, all right. So got some movie buffs here. So I recruited 2 screenwriter friends of mine in LA to actually help me go through and code these movies. And we actually decided, okay, where is the inciting incident? Where's the first act break? Where's the second act break? And we actually did that, and then we used, I'll kind of skip through the coding. We used basically the first 35 minutes of the film, and we asked people to watch and provide continuous responses while they watched. And basically, while they're watching, they actually moved a dial that asked them to respond to the movie. So for example, at this moment, how much are you identifying with the main character? Or at this moment, how much are you liking the main character? And we measured in real time, second by second, how they responded to the movies. And basically, we predicted that a lot of the peaks in these moments would actually line up with the moments that we had coded ahead of time in the story structure. So there's a lot of rich data here, which I won't really have time to get into, but basically, this is a quick graph showing you some of it. So this is the first 35 or 40 minutes of Rise of the Planet of the Apes. And these 2 lines, if you can see them, are the averages across all the people who watch them of the mean levels of identification, which is the blue line, and liking, which is the orange line. And so what you can see is very interesting is that there are definitely, these 2 lines tend to mimic each other, though there are differences. And there are some kind of key moments where they dip together and they increase together. And so what we found is that these did in fact line up with several of the story moments from the screenplay structure. And so we were able to actually predict pretty well when people are going to identify more with the main character and be more engaged in the story. So going forward, I'm going to wrap it up there, but basically I'm hoping to start looking with more, this was kind of looking just at narratives that were not persuasive, but I'm kind of hoping more to look at narratives that are actually also containing a persuasive message and see whether having a message that's persuasive at certain moments in a narrative can really make that message more effective. So I'll stop there. I think I have just like a minute or 2 if there's any questions, and then I know we have to get going. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it. We have time for questions or not?
It'd be interesting to see if your patterns mimic other patterns. You have a dip in the middle, which is usually where the climax of the film is, the lowest part emotionally in the film. It'd be really interesting to see if there are other existing patterns and stories that overlap with your patterns and see if there's a correlation.
So you mean across like different movies and stuff, or different types of stories? Yeah. So yeah, we did find similarities between the 3 movies. We didn't look at the entire length of the 2-hour movie though, because we had a problem with people not wanting to sit and move a dial for 2 hours watching it, which is a difficult problem to overcome. We haven't figured out what to do. So the graph actually ends about 40 minutes into the movie, so we didn't quite get to the climax in this. So this is actually, it's very hard to read, I don't know if you can see it, but basically in seconds, this is like about 1,000 seconds into the movie, so that's 20 minutes, I think, roughly.
It could be the climax
So,
of one of the scenes.
so yeah, so it could be, exactly, yeah. And so we did find these patterns, though, when we, for example, did see the first act break and stuff, we did tend to see patterns where these lines would move on all 3 different movies. So that was kind of what was really interesting, was seeing this pattern, not just in a film, but across 3 different movies that were completely different genres, too. So thank you guys very much. I know we're out of time. Thank you.